Okay, we're going to get started now, just to be respectful of everyone's time. Hi, and welcome to Moving from Fear to Action, Building Frontline Workers' Capacity for Intervention on Domestic Violence. My name is Sidra, and I am the coordinator of the Immigrant and Refugee Communities Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign, and that's a bystander intervention campaign focused on equipping people with the tools to know the signs about domestic violence and also know how to intervene. I'm also a writer and a researcher who focuses on gender-based violence. And thank you all for joining me here today, especially those of you, I'm seeing some familiar names. So those of you who have been here for the past 3 weeks now in this webinar series. Thank you so much. So as you can see, this is part 3 of the webinar series, and it is called Breaking Down Barriers. I just want to remind you all of our vision for this webinar series. Our vision is that all service providers in Ontario will know how to recognize the signs of domestic violence and also know how to offer support to clients who are living with abuse. And I'm just going to give you an overview of what we've covered so far. So as I've mentioned, this is part 3 of a 4-part webinar series. In part 1, we talked about the myths and facts related to domestic violence, as well as the different types of violence you may see in a domestic violence situation, such as financial violence or stalking. That webinar is recorded and available to you. So if you don't have it yet, please send me an email and I will send it to you. Part 2, what to look out for, is what we did last week. And in that webinar, we went over the warning signs of domestic violence and also the signs of high risk, according to what was found by the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. And you can also email me for access to a recording of that webinar. So today, we're going to talk about breaking down barriers. Specifically, what barriers immigrant and refugee women face when they are seeking support for abuse, and how you, as service providers, can bridge those barriers. And then finally, next week, part 4 is the end of the webinar series, and this is going to be a very practical webinar next week where we talk about step-by-step what to do and how to handle a client's disclosure of abuse. So if a client tells you she's living with abuse, what should you say, what should you not say, and what steps should you take? So that will be next week. So let's get started. I do want to issue a trigger warning for this webinar. We are going to be talking about abusive relationships, and some of it could be disturbing for you. So please feel free to leave the webinar if you feel disturbed at any time, because again, this is being recorded and will be available to you, and you can come back to it at another time when you're feeling better. I also want to note that we are going to be talking about male perpetrated violence against women, so men's violence against women. And the reason we're focusing on that kind of violence is it's because what research shows is the most prevalent form of violence and domestic violence. But I do want to acknowledge that men can also be victims of domestic violence. That does happen and is also completely unacceptable. But today we're going to focus on men's violence against women because of the research. Okay. So before we get into the specific barriers that immigrant and refugee women living with abuse may face, I'm going to talk about the challenges that any woman in an abusive relationship may go through, and why it is so difficult for any woman to leave a domestic violence situation. And we're going to start with this myth. This is a very dangerous myth that we need to address if we're talking about barriers to leaving abuse and barriers to getting support for abuse. And that myth is that if a woman is being abused and she doesn't leave, then it's her fault. She should be blamed because she is the one who isn't leaving. So that's a very dangerous myth, but it's also a common myth. You might have heard this in the media, in conversations with friends, people saying, well, why doesn't she leave? What's wrong with her? And we're so used to this being the focus that it seems normal, but it's actually harmful. This is what we call victim blaming. We're blaming the victim of domestic violence for not leaving instead of focusing on the abuser and asking, why is he abusing? So the way to counter this myth is, again, always with the facts. And the fact is that leaving abusive relationships can be very difficult, which is what we're going to talk about today, and even life-threatening. 100% of the blame for abuse belongs on the abuser. So the abuser is 100% responsible for the abuse. It is not the victim's fault if she does not leave. It's the abuser's fault that he is being abusive. So that takes a lot of mental energy to put our focus, because we're so trained to focus on blaming the victim. Why doesn't she leave? So we really have to shift our focus back to the abuser. He is 100% responsible for the abuse, and we need to, as it says on the bottom, stop asking, why doesn't she leave? And start asking, why does he abuse? So do you see that shift? It's very important. Okay, so that's our starting point for our topic today. Stopping asking, why doesn't she leave? And start focusing on, why does he abuse? And we're also going to talk about why it's hard for her to leave. What's in the way between her and safety? And to do that, I'm going to use this diagram because it can help us understand why it's challenging for women to leave abusive relationships. This is the cycle of abuse, and it's not set in stone. Not every abusive relationship follows this pattern, but it's a guideline that we can use to understand, again, how confusing and difficult abusive relationships are. So when you're supporting a client who's living with abuse, being aware of this cycle can help you understand her situation better. So let's just go through the cycle briefly. As you can see, step one of the cycle is something called tensions building. In this stage, the abuser may be giving off signals that he is becoming angry or impatient. And some survivors have described being able to almost feel it in the air when the abuser is in this mode or in this mood. In some cases, at this stage, the survivor may try to calm him down. And they use the word placate here. Try to make him happy. Try to do what he says so that he won't get even more angry. And in the last webinar, I don't know if you remember, but we did talk about trauma and the effects of trauma and how survivors sometimes blame themselves for what is happening. They blame themselves for the abuse and the trauma because it can help them feel a sense of control over their circumstances. The idea is that if it's my fault that someone's abusing me, then maybe if I act differently, I can stop the abuse. So that gives a false sense of control over the situation. So in the tensions building stage, this may be coming into play. The survivor might be thinking, okay, I feel the tension building. Maybe if I'm nice, maybe if I do exactly what he wants, he won't abuse me this time. But the reality is that abusers abuse, and that brings us to stage two of the cycle of abuse, which is the incident. So this incident may be verbal, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. There may be a lot of threats and fear at this stage. Stage three, moving around the circle, is reconciliation. And this isn't true reconciliation. There is no real bridge that's been built here, and things aren't okay. It's kind of like a fake temporary reconciliation. Think of it as putting a plastic Band-Aid on a giant wound. So it's not real reconciliation. It's just a temporary reconciliation. And in this stage, the abuser may apologize. He may give excuses saying that, oh, the incident only happened because I was stressed out. Or he may actually gaslight her. And if you, in webinar 1, we covered the term gaslight and gaslighting. And basically what that is making the survivor feel like the abuse is all in her head and that she's imagining things. So in the reconciliation stage, he may gaslight her. He may say, no, I didn't hurt you. You're imagining it, or it wasn't a big deal. You're exaggerating. He may gaslight her at this stage. And so that moves us to stage 4, which is calm. At this point, the incident is forgotten. And you can see there in the diagram, the word forgotten is in quotation marks. So it's not really forgotten. It's almost as though there's this unspoken rule that, okay, we're not going to talk about what happened anymore from now on. It didn't happen, it's done, it's over, we're not going to talk about it, it's forgotten. And in this stage of calm, the abuser may be kind. It could be like a honeymoon phase. He may give her gifts at this stage and just be generally really nice. Over time, the calm moves back in the cycle to stage 1, which again is where tensions build. And then the whole cycle can carry out again. So you can see how being in something like this would be very confusing. And I want to note something about this cycle in terms of how quickly people move through the cycle. It can happen hundreds of times in an abusive relationship. Each stage can last a different amount of time depending on the relationship. In one abusive relationship, the cycle might happen every single day. In another abusive relationship, this whole cycle may be gone through over the course of months or a year. So it really depends. And I also want to again note that not all domestic violence relationships fit this cycle. It's just a guideline for us to understand some of the patterns. And also very important is that in some cases, as time goes on, the reconciliation stage where they make up and the calm stage actually disappear. And so the domestic abuse situation is nothing but tensions building and an incident, tensions building and another incident. So that's also a pattern we see. So I'm going to now go through why it's challenging to leave an abusive relationship, in addition to what we just saw here in this cycle. And I want to point out that as we're going through this, it might feel overwhelming that there's so many challenges and so many barriers to leaving an abusive relationship. But what I want you to think about as we're discussing this is what you can do as a service provider to bridge some of these challenges. And we'll talk about some practical examples of how you can do that as we go through these lists. So the first reason that it is challenging to leave an abusive relationship is because our social norms, so how we normally interact with each other in society, can make it hard to leave. So I'll just go through with the pointer here. The first social norm is that we tend to blame women if relationships break up. We tend to pressure women to stay in relationships, to make them work. And we tend to say that women have more value if they're in a relationship with a man. So these three first social norms here can make it hard for someone to leave an abusive relationship because she has this social pressure to make her relationship work. She feels that she's more valuable if she's staying in this relationship. So that can make it hard for her to leave. The There's also a social norm to pressure women to forgive abusive men, to be forgiving. That somehow forgiving abuse makes you a nice woman or a good woman. And there can be a social pressure to say that if she doesn't forgive him, if she said, you know what, no, unacceptable, done, that makes her mean. And no one wants to be a mean woman, right? This is a huge social pressure. And there are a lot of really horrible terms people use to describe what they think are mean women. There's also a social norm to make women feel guilty and responsible for abuse that happens to them. You hear questions like, what did she do to provoke that? You know, what did she do to make him abuse her? Instead of asking, why is he abusing her? There's never an excuse for that. And then finally, these last three here, these are ideas that are floating around in our society about women. We tend to see in the media and in how people treat women, people say that women are difficult, crazy, or irrational. And this makes it very difficult for women to be believed when they're talking about abuse that they're going through, because there's already this stereotype that women are, you know, a little crazy, always making problems, irrational. So when it comes to believing women who are living with abuse, these stereotypes can really get in the way. And also, there's this myth we talked about in the first webinar that it's natural for men to be violent when it's not. And generally, we tend to believe and trust men more easily than we believe and trust women. So all of these social norms can make it hard for a woman to tell people about an abusive relationship, feel confident to leave an abusive relationship, and be believed by people if she tells them about what's going on. Next reason it's challenging to leave an abusive relationship is because the abuser may make it hard to leave directly. The abuser may threaten to harm her children if she leaves. He may threaten to report her to immigration authorities, which we'll talk about later. He may promise that the abuse will end, like we saw in the cycle of abuse. In the reconciliation stage, he may say, you know, this will never happen again. He may manipulate her into thinking she deserves abuse, or manipulate her into thinking the abuse is her fault, saying things like, you made me do this to you. Or he may manipulate her into thinking the abuse is not that bad. He may directly tell her that no one will believe her or help her, which would make it hard for her to leave if she's convinced that there's no support out there. He may isolate her from her friends, family, and other support. He may monitor who she talks to and where she goes, and he may make her feel like she is responsible for him. And then finally, it can be challenging to leave an abusive relationship because our social systems make it hard to leave. And this is what we're going to talk about in the second part of the webinar in more detail, but briefly, it can be very difficult to access counseling to cope with the effects of abuse. It can be difficult to access childcare, to get full custody of children away from an abusive partner, to prove that abuse is happening in court systems, to access an emergency shelter because they can be full a lot of the time, to find affordable housing, wait lists are very long, and to afford the cost of market rent. We all know that the cost of living in Ontario is going up and up. So these social systems also make it hard to leave. So now we have social norms, you know, beliefs about women that make it hard to leave, the abusers doing all of these tactics to make it hard to leave, and then we have social systems that make it very difficult for women to leave as well. So hopefully this will all really convince us to stop asking that question, why doesn't she leave, and to blame her for staying. And as we'll talk about later, there are additional barriers, in addition to everything we've just talked about, for immigrant and refugee women living with abuse. And I just want to make a note about this slide. As a service provider, any referrals that you can make that can help with what's up on the slide right now, affordable housing, legal support around custody issues, childcare, finding counseling in your area to refer her to. All of these referrals can make a big difference for her. So we're just going to review what we talked about with two videos. One is, this first one is a public service announcement by Interval House. We saw the first public service announcement in this series in webinar 1. And so what it is it's showing the dialogue of an abuser and how he presents himself in the public. And as we're listening to this public service announcement, listen for tactics that he's using that's making it hard for her, his ex, to leave. And also see if you notice anything from the cycle of abuse. So I'm just going to pull up this video now. Sorry, there was just a technical difficulty with the video. I'm going to pull it up on my main screen here and share it with you. Okay.
So we're going to talk about, do you know who that is immediately?
Yeah, she jumps to mind pretty quick. Her name was Sarah. We met at a New Year's Eve party. You know, when we broke up, it was brutal. Didn't eat, couldn't sleep. She was gone, and my world just shattered. And you try so hard to make it work, to make it work, to make it work. After we would fight, you know, I would buy her earrings or a necklace or something, just some way to apologize. I would call and I'd leave messages, or I'd call and I'd call and I'd call. Her voicemail was always full, and she'd be gone, or she'd be busy, or they wouldn't let me talk to her. You know, it was just like, pick up the phone. It's like, it's because you want to, because you love them so much, you know. I'd give anything to get my hands on her again.
So hopefully you were able to hear that video clearly. I will send the link to you as well. But from that video, we can notice something from the cycle of abuse. So he mentioned that he would get her earrings and a necklace to apologize. And that, to me, looks like the reconciliation phase or the calm phase of the cycle of abuse. And also, how does he make it hard for her to leave? He would not stop calling, and he says, even though people wouldn't let him talk to her. So she was so afraid that she had other people setting that boundary with him, and he would not listen. He's showing what we would call stalking behavior. And if you remember from webinar number 2, stalking behavior is a really high-risk behavior associated with domestic homicide. So we can see all of that from this public service announcement of why it is difficult, how the abuser makes it difficult to leave. And next, we're just going to hear briefly from an actual survivor of domestic violence named Leslie Morgan Steiner. And she gave a TED Talk on her experience of domestic violence and survival. I will send you the full link when I email out resources. But for now, we're just going to watch a short clip of the TED Talk. The full TED Talk is about 16 minutes long, so we don't have time for that today. But I'm going to show you a short link and a clip of it where she addresses the issue of why it is difficult to leave. So I'm going to pull up that video now.
I was a very strong, deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave?
So that's a very powerful talk. And she also does mention family court systems and issues of custody. And this is a major reason why it is difficult for women to leave, because it's difficult to prove that they are the more fit parent and deserve full custody of their children. So what can end up happening is that women have to, as Leslie described, have their children have unsupervised visits with the abusive partner. And also, because of this joint custody, if that's what ends up happening, she will have to keep in communication with the abusive partner because of the kids. Okay, so we've seen very clearly why it is difficult to leave an abusive situation. And what's amazing about survivors is that so many women do end up being able to leave. And again, I want to make it really, really clear. It's so important if you're working with a client and she's planning to leave an abusive situation, that she has a safety plan. Because as we just heard from this talk, leaving can be a very dangerous time and a high risk time. So it's important to have a safety plan in place, and I will send you a link to safety plan templates. All right. So, whoops. So we're going to now talk about, in addition to everything we just covered, additional barriers faced by immigrant and refugee women who are seeking support for abuse. First is immigration status. So as we know, some women's status in Canada is not secure. For example, they're women who are in the process of being sponsored by a spouse. So this could be an inland spousal sponsorship, where the partner is sponsoring her to be a permanent resident. And if this same partner is being abusive towards her, this can pose challenges. Women who are in the process of making a refugee claim, their status in Canada is not secure. Women who are in Canada on student visas, women who are in Canada as migrant workers or live-in caregivers, and also women with no legal status in Canada, so non-status women. And there are many ways that one can become non-status. You could have a rejected refugee claim, a work permit or a student visa that has expired, a spousal sponsorship that has broken down. These are all ways that women can become non-status and living in Canada. And then the last way that women's status in Canada may not be secure is if they do have permanent residency, but their status is being called into question because of allegations of fraud. if they're being accused of lying on their permanent residence application or other documents. So women whose status in Canada is tied to or dependent on an abuser may fear leaving that relationship. So like we just talked about, women who are being sponsored by an abusive partner. Women may be making a refugee claim alongside an abusive partner, and the claim may be heavily based on evidence related to his story. And also, women who do not have legal status in Canada may be working under the table or receiving other supports from an abusive partner. And a major aspect of that situation is that an abuser may threaten to report a woman who doesn't have status to immigration authorities as a way to control her. So holding this threat over her head as a way to make sure that she does what he says, doesn't leave, that kind of thing. So I want to be really clear that if you're working with someone who is in any of these situations, it's important to be aware that the immigration and refugee system, as you all know, in Canada is very complicated and every case is unique. So if there is a woman who's disclosed that she's living with abuse and her status in Canada is not secure, what we really suggest is that you use this resource. And this is a resource of, from Legal Aid Ontario. And basically, the resource that is available is that if you are experiencing domestic violence and need legal assistance, you can call Legal Aid Ontario for a free 2-hour consultation with a private lawyer. And this is regardless of your immigration status in Canada. So if you do not have status in Canada and you are experiencing domestic violence, you can still get 2 hours of legal advice from a lawyer. And what's also positive about this is that there is interpretation services. There are interpretation services available for non-English or non-French speakers. The phone number is here, and you can also check out the Legal Aid website for more information about this. So what we really suggest, if someone's immigration status in Canada is not secure, get legal advice about what her options could be. The next barrier that can be faced by immigrant and refugee women living with abuse is language barriers. She may not have English or French language skills, even though she's fluent in many other languages, potentially. This can be a barrier to leaving abuse because she may have no one to talk to about what is happening. And she may be isolated from supportive people who also speak her language. She may not be able to access information about abuse that in her language that she speaks. And she may not be able to access the services she needs in her language. And she may not be able to access interpreters who will keep confidentiality. So if the interpreters she relies on are connected to her community, connected potentially to the abuser, she might be afraid to use those interpreters. So there's 2 resources I want you to be aware of that can help with this barrier. The first is the Assaulted Women's Helpline. This is a helpline that provides counseling, emotional support, information, and referrals 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. And the service is available in over 200 languages. So if you want to provide your client with a fast way to interact with someone who she can speak to about the abuse in a confidential way in her language, this is a great resource. And the phone number and website are here. The second resource I want you to be aware of is the Language Interpreter Services. And this is an Ontario-wide service. Interpreters are available in over 70 languages, including ASL, and this is for you. It's for service providers who, it's to enable them to communicate with clients who are victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, or trafficking. So to find out more about eligibility for that program, you can visit the website here. The third additional barrier that is faced by immigrant and refugee women living with abuse is the economic barriers. While many women face economic barriers, this is especially true for immigrant and refugee women in Ontario. Research has shown that immigrant and refugee women in Ontario are overrepresented in the lowest paying and least stable jobs. Racialized, so that's another word for visible minority, immigrant and refugee women will most likely have a lower income than other women. And this is a graph from a report called Unprotected, Unrecognized, and it was created by the Migrant Mothers Project at the University of Toronto. What it demonstrates is that in Ontario, gender and race are tied to poverty. So not all immigrant and refugee women are racialized, but for those who are, there's a higher likelihood that they will be living in poverty or in lower income. And I will send you a full report, a link to the full report after this webinar. There are many resources and interventions to address the poverty of immigrant and refugee women, such as job training, recognition of foreign credentials, removing the barrier of needing Canadian experience in order to be hired, increasing the amount of affordable housing we have, and ensuring a livable minimum wage. These are all interventions that can address the poverty of immigrant and refugee women. But I'm going to put up one resource here that may be of use, and this is the Portable Housing Benefit. The governments of Canada and Ontario have invested over $20 million over 2 years to support survivors of domestic violence in finding housing. And this is a portable benefit, so they can take it to a different community. They will not be tied to finding what is available in their own community. I'm going to be emailing you a link to what communities are eligible for this portable housing benefit pilot program after this webinar. And if you have any questions about any of this, we'll go over that at the end of today's talk. The final additional barrier that is faced by immigrant and refugee women is discrimination. So think about all of the barriers that we talked about today, about leaving an abusive relationship. There are social norms that tend to blame women and encourage them to fix relationships instead of leave them if they're harmful. There are social systems that make it difficult for women to leave. There are tactics that abusers use to keep their victims trapped there with them. And on top of all of that, there is discrimination that can be faced by immigrant and refugee women survivors of abuse. So when an immigrant or refugee woman seeks support for abuse, studies have shown that she may face discrimination instead of support. Her whole community, her whole culture, her whole race, or her whole religion may be stereotyped and blamed. And I'm just going to show you an example from a research paper that was put out by Masia Ahmadzai. She researched the experiences of visible minority domestic violence survivors in Southern Ontario. And she documented some of those experiences of discrimination that survivors faced. And so here's a real-life example from that research paper. A survivor says, "So I go to meet my abuser's probation officer, and she's like, 'This,' talking about the domestic violence, 'this is all because of your culture and your religion. Do you even understand the law? Do you even speak English? Do you get these things? like you just married him for money and to come to Canada, right? Sadly, these kinds of comments and statements and stereotypes are too common, and this is a barrier that as service providers we can do a lot to eliminate, because anti-racism training and just encouraging people to let go of racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia when they're providing service to clients can go a long way. Okay, and the last thing we would want is for someone who finally gathers the courage to reach out for support to face something like this. A resource to be aware of is the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Everyone has the right to be free from discrimination when they receive goods or services or use facilities. So to find out more about human rights and how a claim can be made, you can visit the Ontario Human Rights Commission website. And we talked about this myth in the first webinar, and this is just another way to challenge discrimination, is to challenge the myth that immigrant cultures are barbaric and that it is their cultures and religions that cause domestic violence, and instead affirm the fact that domestic violence happens across all cultures, including Euro-Canadian cultures. Racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia are a barrier to service for immigrant women survivors. So that's just reviewing what we talked about in webinar 1 on this issue. All right, well, I'm just going to end with one final slide on bridging barriers, because it can be very daunting to see all of these obstacles in the way, but it's very important for us not to lose hope and to see how much we can do, especially as service providers in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, to make it that much easier for women to find safety. So as a service provider, there's a lot you can do. And what I'm in the process of developing is an audit that you can carry out at your agency to see how supportive your agency is to survivors of abuse. So what policies and procedures are there that are helpful, and what policies and procedures maybe need to be looked at and reevaluated. So you have a key role as a service provider in eliminating service barriers for immigrant and refugee women living with abuse. Here are some questions you can ask. Does your agency have an access without fear policy? This policy means that you do not ask for proof of status in Canada before offering services. If it is at all possible to have this policy, if it doesn't get in the way of other requirements that you're funded to carry out, absolutely, this would be a #1 recommendation. Because think about that, that case that we talked about, the barrier around immigration status. If there is a woman without status in Canada who is being abused and being threatened by the abuser to report her if she were to plan to leave or seek support. If your agency asks for proof of status, it may not feel safe for her to go there to reach out for help. So having an access without fear policy, look into that. Try to make that happen at your agency. Also asking, does your agency prioritize clients' access to language interpreters? So what does that look like if there is a client who does not have strong language skills? Is there a practice of, if there's a couple and a husband and wife, for example, and the husband speaks English well and the wife does not, is there a practice to just rely on him to interpret everything for her? Or do you make sure that she has access to a language interpreter and that she's able to communicate with people directly about what she needs? Are your coworkers trained in how to respond to disclosures of domestic violence? So are they aware of making sure not to ask things like, well, why don't you just leave? Or, encouraging her to, just be nicer to him and maybe it'll end, or saying things that are harmful like, oh, well, maybe this is happening because of your culture. Has that training happened? Do people know what to say? And I would encourage you, especially those of you who've been here for this whole series, next week we're really going to get into detail about what to say if someone discloses. So encourage your coworkers to join in on that conversation and share what you've learned with them. And this is a big one. Are there posters and flyers around your office that women living with abuse can access? Would they know who to talk to if they needed help? And is there a private space available for them to talk? So having these visuals is important to signal that this is a conversation that you can have here. Sometimes people think, well, no one talks to us about domestic violence, so maybe it isn't happening. But the truth is that maybe we haven't created a space where people feel comfortable being able to talk to about it. So if you have those posters, if you have flyers, if you have a system where you can let people know, even in an intake process, that, here's where you go if you need support with domestic violence, here's what you do. Here's where the washroom is, here's what our other policies are, here's what you need, here's where you go for support on domestic violence. Just putting it right out there at the beginning in your systems so that people are aware that it's something that they can talk to you about. Another question is, has your agency built relationships with shelters, legal clinics, and other services for women living with abuse in your area? So as you know, referrals are always more powerful if you really know the place that you're referring people to, and have a phone number that you can call of a worker there who you can talk through a situation with, and really make the best of the referral and work as a team. So building those relationships and saying, hey, we serve immigrant and refugee women. If this issue comes up, like, are you someone we could call? Are you, like, can you tell me more about your programs? Doing that work and having these networks be up to date. And then finally, does your agency have an anti-racism policy and practice? So again, making sure that when we're supporting women living with abuse, we aren't stereotyping cultures, because again, that can be so harmful and devastating for women who are looking for support. So what we're going to talk about in the audit that we're developing for agencies to see how supportive they are for women living with abuse are these 3 A's, and that is to ask all these questions that are listed here on this slide. Advocate. So if they aren't, if coworkers aren't trained, or if, there could be an access without fear policy, but just need the willingness to take it on. If there could be relationships with shelters, but it just needs to be made a priority. You can be an advocate at your agency to help see those changes happen. And finally, to act. I know for me, a lot of the time when I'm doing this work, it feels like I'm just doing it, making these slides, making these webinars, training people, taking all these actions, and you wonder, okay, is it helping or not? And the day that you get a phone call from someone who's in this exact situation, and you have all of your research in place, you have your policies in place, the staff is trained to be able to offer support. If all of that's in place, you will see the difference that it makes, and really be able to ideally change someone's life. So it's that action is always worth it. And I am here to support you in that. So please, please send me an email if any of this inspires you and you say, you know what, I want to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm not sure where to start. Please email me. I would love to be a part of that with you. And I do want to share some posters. Actually, speaking of posters, you'll remember from the first webinar we had some draft drawings that were made by Hannah Shafi for our campaign, and now the final posters are ready, and we're going to be printing them, and they will be available to you. And so here's one. It's not your fault if someone is hurting you. So you could have that up in your office where, you know, there is help. Okay. Being in a new country is hard. Let's take care of each other, right? Our communities are vibrant and caring, right? We're always taking care of each other in so many ways. So let's add taking care of abuse to that. So it says, learn how to help someone living with abuse at home. Okay. And then this one, if someone you knew was being abused, would you know what to do? Right? So this poster is more targeted to the cousin or friend of someone who knows someone who's living with abuse, and what can they do to help her? And then these are the cards that you saw, some of the pictures in our first webinar. And these cards, what they're going to have, there's 9 different cards, and what they show is 2 different situations. One is a healthy situation, so let's dance, it's your family's big day. And then the second one is a unhealthy situation, so I don't like you dancing at weddings. And the reason we chose these 2 actually was feedback from one community who said that when they see abusive relationships happening in their community, this is the way that it starts. It starts with stopping them from doing this, stopping them from dancing at weddings, and that's the starting point. And from there, it progresses to violence. So we wanted to show this to help people spot it right away. This was feedback we got from another community, that a way that they see abuse happening in their community is that the man kind of acts like the master of the castle, and he starts demanding that food be ready at a certain time, getting very angry if she does not have it all ready for him, and then progressing to abuse from there. So on the inside of the cards, there's a lot of information about all the different kinds of abuse, like we talked about in webinar 1. So financial abuse, physical abuse, and then where to go for help. There's resources at the back and some questions that the person can ask themselves. So these are going to be ready soon, these cards. And one last card just to show you, this is about sexual violence. So it's showing how the healthy situation is just to say, let's go to sleep if someone does not want to participate. And the sexual violence situation where she's being pressured on the basis of being his wife, when in fact we know that in Canada, marital rape is illegal and consent is required for every single act. It does not matter if you're married 100 years, you still need consent. And so we have that as one of our cards too. So I'm just going to open it up for